Well, hello, and welcome to episode 7 of A Lesson Before Writing. I'm Ted Morrissey. I'm here with my co hosts, including Grant Tracy, and this is Grant's book, Neon Kiss, in hardcover. We did a special collector's edition recently, which includes a new introduction by Grant titled Crime Noir and the Poetics of Uncertainty. So we also have a new Hayden Fuller mystery we're working on for Grant, a Shoeshine Kill that'll be out in 2024. So that's all very good. And then I'm also here with my co-host Brady Harrison, who this is a little bit older title, The Term Between, a collection of stories, but it won the High Plains Book Award just a couple months ago and has gotten some really great reviews of late. So we redid the cover to put that little badge on there. So that's terrific. But we're also working on Brady's novel, A Journey to Al Ramel. And I think I want to talk to Brady about that in particular this episode. But I'll just mention very quickly my book, Delta of Cassiopeia, which is collected stories and sonnets. It's been out in paperback for a little while. It's done pretty well for itself, for story collection kind of thing. I always plug an older 12 Winters Press book. And I wanted to mention this one, The Endless Unbegun, by Rachel Jamison Webster. And this is a collection of prose and poetry. This is one of the very first books that we did. But I don't know if you guys have paid attention, but Rachel Jamison Webster has kind of hit the big time the last year or so with a book. I got to get the title just right. Benjamin Banneker and Us, 11 Generations of an American Family. It's just won all kinds of awards. And she's been, in all kinds of interviews and in big time publications. And I just am really happy for her. She teaches creative writing at Northwestern, which, I'm an Illinois person, so that's not too far off the grid here. And I didn't even remember until I started looking at it a few minutes ago. But in addition to the book itself, there's actually an interview with Rachel Jamison Webster in the back of the book. So if you're a Rachel Jamison Webster fan, get a hold of The Endless Unbegun, if for no other reason, to read that early interview with her. All right. So I'm going to stop yammering for a second and see, Brady and Grant, if you have anything you'd like to share at the beginning here as we get started.
Yeah, I don't want to jump the shark here, but I am going to talk about Radio Sky as I'm talking about character. But a thing I've noticed out of a lot of MFA stories and literary fiction is layering. And how does one do that? Do you do it in the process of the first draft, or is it something you do later? So, one of the big themes in that story is communication. So in terms of building character, there's ways in which you just keep adding details or having details that reflect that theme. And that really helps. So you got the radio towers, you've got antennas, you've got a phone, you've got the fact that she was wanting to be maybe a Foley artist, which is sound related. That's a Hollywood thing where you create the sounds of horse hooves with all kinds of, it's a whole art unto itself. So that's classic characterization, is finding those details, accumulative details, to support the theme, but also to add to the psychology of the character. And then the second thing that story does, which is a technique I always tell my students, when in doubt, when you're writing a story and you're getting to perhaps a stopping point, you might need a counter movement. And the best way to have a counter movement for a character-driven story, I think, is to have another character show up. And so this story brilliantly has another character show up who becomes a bridge to communication. And I don't want to give anything else away, and we're going to talk about the story more in a few minutes. But those are two techniques that I find really helpful, is what I call layering. Like Ron Carlson talks about, when you write a story, you're throwing balls in the air, you're juggling. He calls them variables. And you got to figure out what your variables are. And so in this story, there's a series of variables that are in the air. And then, Charles Baxter says sometimes a story, can get overdetermined, and that's when you need a counter movement. So the counter movement of this character coming in takes the story in kind of a new direction that it needs, a bridge to the end. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. But those are two techniques for character building that I've seen a lot of writers use, and I think this story uses very successfully.
Okay, so just to provide some context here, since Grant did kind of jump ahead a little bit, so
Sorry,
we
man.
always do a featured story, and what he's talking about is a story called Radio Sky by Bryn Chancellor, which appeared in a recent issue of Ecotone, and so we're going to talk about that. Of course, it's all relative because when I post this to our a lesson before writing website, it'll say the featured story. So anyway, I think people will understand. But yeah, just a little context. So those are great points, and we're going to want to revisit those when we get kind of to the point where we're talking about that story in the podcast. So terrific. So Brady.
Uh, yeah, Grant has caught me off guard. Should we just dive into the story? One of
Sure.
the things, since Grant is establishing principles, one of the techniques that Chancellor uses here, and is one that I love, and is both interesting technique, just in terms of modes of storytelling, but also I think really helps build character and create tension in the story, is to double characters, to have doubles, to have doppelgangers, to have evil twins or uneval twins, and so part of how the story very carefully layers, as Grant says, so much information, so many ideas. But another way, with the introduction of that second character, which is a double. She is a double in a way, a mirrored double, right? She's got the odd square mirrored sunglasses, but the character is a double of the primary character, the protagonist.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you because what you're saying is fantastic, and I had a lot of the same thoughts, but we're completely backward here. Let me give a little bit of context for what the hell this story is about, and then maybe our listeners and viewers can get a better. Right now, we just sound like three old drunks at the pub. Just
no, I was just thinking. I don't. It's 10 o'clock where I am. Different time where Ted and Grant are. We are not drinking. This is tea. This is in the cup my daughter gave me with pictures of me and my daughter. Yes, it's tea.
All right. So again, this is a short story called Radio Sky by Bryn Chancellor, and I'll give a little bit of info about Bryn in just a few minutes here. Kind of insert that. But again, this is a story that appeared in a recent issue of Ecotone. Everyone puts the date of their publication elsewhere. Oh, okay, here it is. Spring, summer 2023. So again, very, very recent. Let me just read from the beginning of the story and then give a little bit of a synopsis. I was thinking as we prepared for this podcast that it's obviously we always give some spoilers. We don't want to give too much away, but this is a tricky one because it does kind of go back and forth in time in a way that it's hard to know where to stop. But hopefully I have a sense here. But this is how Radio Sky begins by Bryn Chancellor. At the Shaw Butte Trailhead in North Phoenix, Lou strapped on a sun hat and tugged up her bright yellow and black compression socks with "I'm the bee's knees, motherfucker" printed on the band. Remnants from her failed athletic clothing venture, Kiki. Last night, post-birthday party fight with her mother, she'd drunk only seltzer but felt hungover after subbing a shift at the Palm View and then binging on cake and a slew of nature and science articles. She squinted at the radio towers at the summit, wishing she could see the crusts and troughs of the electromagnetic waves. She listened for the phantom hum and squeal that probably was tinnitus, but that she liked to believe was a frequency she could tune into like a dog or a bat. Test, test, she sat into the recorder app on her phone. Her voice came back tinny, alien. Okay, so our main character here, Lou, who also goes by Lucia, I'm not sure, and also the nickname Lucky. She is 39 or about to turn 39, and she keeps starting one enterprise, one career, one path after another, it never works out. And her mother is very critical of how she has all these false starts and never seems to kind of get her life on track. We discover she had been a really standout soccer player in her youth, but a really bad knee injury kind of brought that to an end. And so, again, since then, she's been trying one thing after another, but her most recent passion is this Foley project or career. And quite honestly, I was not familiar. I'm sure you guys are, especially Grant, because of your film interests and expertise and so forth. But as I think Brady has already mentioned, it's where film particularly, but it could be, I guess a podcast, or in the old days, it started with radio, is augmented with audio effects rather, because it's so hard to capture just with the microphone. So you use other things that sound like the things that are supposed to be represented in the film. And so she is really into this. So she is climbing this sort of mountain to get to the summit where all these radio towers are. And while she's on her way, she's recording the sound of her footsteps and whatever else she's hearing, and is really into it. But as she nears the summit, and again, this is when it gets tricky to know when to stop the synopsis, but she thinks she hears a voice calling for help. And as she's trying to look down into this little ravine type thing, she loses her balance and she ends up in the ravine, unconscious for a time. And then the rest of the story is kind of her sort of sliding in and out of consciousness, remembering the past, not sure where she is, and remembering that she's in this terrible dilemma, and so forth. And so anyway, that's kind of the setup to the story. And I know we've already kind of jumped ahead of that a little bit already, which is fine. But I don't know, would any of you guys augment my synopsis with any important details that I left out?
No, that sounds right.
I was just going to say too, with the doubling, right? I mean, she thinks she hears something and thinks that someone needs help, and then later she needs help, right? I mean, so there's more of that layering that I talked about earlier. So yeah,
right.
and all, like, and you were saying, radio tower, the antennas, all that stuff with communication. It's layered throughout. Foley work, recordings, phones, all that stuff. I mean, it's just, I think it's very expertly handled. The thing that I might add to that is, I think what can get really interesting in fiction is when a writer chooses a misfit detail, but something that doesn't quite fit, and then that kind of opens up possible. So that's another thing for our listeners out there. If you're trying to, we layer all this stuff because we have a theme that we discovered later. My theory is, anyway, we discover it later after we've written the piece, and then we layer it. But sometimes it's really cool to have something that doesn't quite align with all that stuff, and that can sometimes be in the counter movement or whatever. In this story, it pretty much aligns, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you guys have an example. And it's not like you need a misfit detail, but a misfit detail sometimes is a really cool choice to make. So, for example, in Ernest Hemingway's The Killers, there's a series of misfit details. I mean, the lead character wants to be a hero. He knows they're going to kill a Swede. He tries to stop the murder. He goes on a quest, but it's a failed quest. The Swede doesn't want to be rescued. The Swede's just waiting for the killers to come get him. He goes to the boarding house. The name on the boarding house is one thing, but the woman that he meets isn't the name of the woman on the boarding house. The diner that Nick is working in has a name, but it's not the name of who's working there. It's Henry and George. I can't remember, but it's been a while since I read the story. So Hemingway keeps layering these thwarted misfit details because he's trying to show a world that's not in sync. Like there's something's off, and the quest narrative is going to be off in the larger story. So anyway, that's a good technique for building character. It's a little bit of a sidebar, but I wanted to mention that for our listeners out there.
Okay, Brady, thoughts?
No, I'm just so struck by Grant is describing. One of the and I have no I have no responses. I need to think more about what Grant's suggesting. I like it very well, and I know the of course the killers. So I'm going to dig that out as soon as we're done today. So I'll just jump forward. But one of the ways I think that this story works well in creating character is kind of literally a kind of telescoping or a shifting of frames of reference. And so, of course, if anyone who knows me knows I like to walk, and so story about walking up a hill is my kind of story. But then there are the radio towers, and Grant's already mentioned there's this whole theme of communication and keeping in touch and losing touch and broken bonds. But also there's references, and there's sort of this technique of zooming in and out, references of the character thinks about radio towers and how they can be used as a telescope, which takes us out into the cosmos. Mm-hmm. Right? That's really interesting technique for capturing the quality of mind and how our minds work, the psychology of the character, how grounded is this character, literally on the ground, hoofing it up this hill, but then also thinking as part of this bigger process of what transpires in the story, this going as far away from the self as one could imagine to the macro cosmic forces, right? The dust beneath our feet, the dust that we are, and then the creation of the dust in the cosmic engines. It's really interesting, small details. So it's not only a telescoping, but it's done pretty quietly. It's just part of the natural development of the character. So I think pretty expertly handled here. But so I guess I haven't quite decided on what term I want to use to describe this, but a kind of shifting layers of reference and depth of consciousness and perception. Try to say it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read this story now like 3 times, and the first time I read it, again, because of the fact the main character Lou, hits her head out from this terrible fall and blacks out and so forth. So then from that point forward, I'm in this state of uncertainty where is this all really happening, or is this just her perceptions because she's got a concussion and she's severely dehydrated and yada yada yada, and to the point where so like when that doubling starts to happen, and so I guess we'll just go a little bit further here. So that this woman eventually shows up to try to help her, and there's some question, at first at least in my mind, because of the fact Lou thought she heard someone down in this canyon or whatever who needed help, and now we have someone standing above her who may be offering her help. Is that really happening, or is that just her hallucination where she thinks? I was thinking of the classic story, the Ambrose Bierce story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where the spy, the Confederate spy, Yankee spy, I forget, is being about to be hanged at the bridge, and the whole story is about how the rope breaks and he escapes and gets back home, and then you realize, oh, that's actually just what was flashing through his mind as his body descended before his neck is broken, by the noose or whatever. And I know, Grant, you've mentioned the story Bullet in the Brain, which is kind of a similar, where it's all happened. So anyway, I was not sure at first if this was supposed to be hallucinatory or real. After a third reading, I'm pretty sure it's all real, but there's still this really interesting juxtaposition going on between these two characters. And I'll just very quickly mention, until I'll give up the screen here, that it also reminds me of William H. Gass's The Peterson Kid, where the main character is this 12-year-old boy, Yorga, and eventually in the story, just to give a really brief synopsis here, they have to go to the Peterson farm, and then it seems as if the Peterson Kid and Yorga, the main character, the narrator, switch places by the end of the story, and it's hard to know who is who, which is which. What the hell has happened here? 60 years later, gas people are still kind of arguing, debating about what even happens at the end of that story, but it has something to do with switching these almost identical characters. And what does that mean exactly?
We've talked about this a lot, and this is a kind of obsession of mine. So just to go along with Ted's point, I love parts of stories, and this exactly in this story, that tension that the author can create in the reader, right? We talk about ambiguity in stories, but how I like to think of it is the relationship between the writer, the work, and the reader, taking the ground out from people, right? I mean, it's psychologically interesting, and it puts pressure back on the reader. It makes the story interactive, right? As we're trying to sort through. So I like that. I like that feature very well, and I certainly shared it too. Is the double? How many doubles are there? As Grant pointed out, what's the sound that Lou hears first? That's the first double, and then the second double, and then there are parts where clearly it's memory. One of the things I would want to talk, and I'll stop, let Grant jump in. But one of the things I want to come back to is the psychology and the writer's interest in human psychology and how it's developed in this story, but also just as a matter of writerly interest. So maybe come back to that. But anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, I do think one of the things about the story that gives it, and that's another thing I talk about with characterization, or at least plotting, is narrative escalation, life or death stakes, real or imagined, figurative or literal. And in this story, it's very literal, right? I mean, this is a survival story. And so that lends itself to a kind of a feeling of the uncanny, putting the character in like what Brady was talking about, in a situation they're not used to, and then how do they handle it? And then that adds to all the stuff you were saying, Ted, where it's real, imagined. I mean, there's even this is what I'm saying about little details, right? Little details. What is the music she mentioned? Check Your Head. Great album, by the way, by the Beastie Boys. Yeah. Why did she not say Armed Forces by Elvis Costello? Why did it not be, London Calling? Well, London Calling would have worked because it would have been communication.
Yeah,
but but there's
faraway towns.
Yeah. But there's definitely a just by the album, like, it adds to that layering that I was talking. Check your head. Well, she's got to check her head. Like, is what she's feeling real? Is this happening? Or is it imagined? I mean, I think it's real too, but I love the little reference to the Beastie Boys. I think it totally fits with the story.
Well, I have to admit, I didn't get the Beastie Boys reference, but I did get the Walt Whitman reference.
Well,
she where is it at? So this is page 50. If you guys have your copy ahead here, but she even says she's remembering a poem. She says, "I depart as air," she whispered, or tried to. "I shake my white locks at the runaway sun." She hadn't read that poem in years, but somehow the lines stayed in her. And thanks to Google, I was able to. That's Song of Myself 52. But it's interesting because Whitman seems to be talking about what he's going to leave behind after he dies. And so since you suddenly have this, very pertinent question, is this woman going to survive? And she's thinking about a poem about what remains of us after we die. And so anyway, it's a kind of foreshadowing, I think, that really adds to the tension, or is it foreshadowing? I guess, that's the question that it raises. But again, is every reader going to get that? No, and so some do, some don't. Some can go back and double check and so forth if they're so inclined. But our last episode, I think it was, where we talked about illusions and what they can do for a story. And I don't know that I made the point, and so in case I didn't, and it's such a brilliant point, I want to make it here. No, what I think of in terms of illusions Obviously, not every reader is going to get every illusion, depending on, particularly if they're kind of, out of date or obscure or whatever. But I think of it like a painter, and Brady, you're a painter. Um, Adding layers of color to a canvas, even though ultimately they're going to be covered up by whatever ends up in the foreground of the composition, yet those background colors do add something to the finished painting, even though, a viewer probably couldn't look at it and say, oh, 7 layers deep, there's ochre or whatever, So even though you're not really seeing them consciously, they somehow add to the depth and the complexity of the composition. And to me, adding illusions, even if they're a little bit on the obscure side, will have a similar sort of effect on the reader. They'll add depth and complexity, even if it's almost at a sort of unconscious level for the reader. Let me go back to you, Brady, because let me here. Cover of Brady's book is Brady's painting, or one of them. So anyway, that's what I'm referring to in particular. But what are your thoughts on that in particular, the adding of layers to a painting in a similar way to using illusions?
Oh no, that I love that because I'm no painter. There's certain habits, hobbies. Yeah, I'm just terrible. Yeah, like guitar. I'm even worse at guitar, granted. But there's, Hemingway, famously or infamously had the idea of the iceberg lettuce, the iceberg theory of fiction. And I love the way you're talking about and this goes back to Grant's, that layering of details. And even if in the painting, it's particularly in oils. Oils is what I love about oil painting is that just the merest suggestions of some of the underlayers are still there. And so illusions and synapses, and it adds to the complexity and the quality. And there's a certain mysteriousness, after all, about a lot of art. And I think some of that in visual, in painting, might be that kind of layered and the ghostliness of things beneath. The layering of details here and how a story shapes itself in the mind of the reader. Those details, whether they're in the forefront of their thinking or their consciousness, or it's part of the kind of deeper layers of the experience. That's terrific. Yeah, I love that. Talking about two different art forms, and how they both rely on depth.
And I think from a writerly standpoint, Brady, there's a way in which, again, this is just my theory and how it works for me. I don't want to stand in for everybody, but there's at least in my process, there's just a lot of happy accidents. I don't know what I'm doing half the time. And I feel like I'm, like Bob Dylan. I'm not Bob Dylan, but Bob Dylan said channeling the universe. Sometimes I just feel like, because I've read a lot of narratives, a lot of stuff pops into my head and then I use it and it just works. But then when you get to the revision process, you start to look at those variables I was talking about earlier. What are the balls that I'm juggling in the air? And can I do more with this to give the story even deeper resonance? And then, so once the theme emerges, right, then I go back and layer stuff like, check your head might be a detail I would put in later instead of it being something that would be in the early draft. I mean, I can't speak for the writer, but I just know how I work. And that's one of the things that I do is just go on instinct and then start to see stuff and then decide to put those layers or enrich those layers, I guess.
Well, I just to jump in, sorry, Ted. That idea of spontaneous connections, and we have these incredible things in our skulls, these like immensely wired cosmos of associations and ideas. But we don't. I mean, hardly do we know what we're always doing. I mean, right. Couldn't be farther from the truth. Right. I mean, it's a process of discovery. It's a process of association. It's a process of details coming to mind. I mean, Alice Munro said, you have to listen to the story.
Yep.
You can't make the story. The story finds its way. It tells you. It talks back.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, and this is one of the things I talk to my students about, particularly my MFA students, I think oftentimes writers who are a little bit newer to this game, they give up too soon. they start writing a story, or they think it's going to be a novel or whatever it might be, and they write, I don't know, a few thousand words or something, and it doesn't seem to be working. And so they just kind of give up on it and think, well, this isn't going to work, and they go on to something else. And of course, I think we've all probably been there, where we do actually literally eventually give up on stuff, or at least shelve it for 20 years. But at the same time, I've gotten to the point where I know, okay, it's not great right now. I don't know what this story is about. This character is pretty two-dimensional, but if I just hang in there and keep writing, eventually the story is going to show me the way. And I've mentioned in a podcast episode or two ago that I've started this book that's a sequel to my novel, Untimely Frost. I took one of the very minor characters out of that book and is now the central character of this new book. And I wrote 8,000 words, and, sentence for sentence, they were okay, but I don't even know what the hell this story is about, and blah, blah, blah. But then it was like, like the sun coming up. I mentioned in the introduction to this book, which I started writing when I was in Honolulu, that I would get up every morning before the sun came up and sit on the balcony in the 14th floor of my hotel, and the ocean was out there somewhere, but I couldn't see it. It was just pitch dark. And so I'd sit there for, an hour or so, just drinking Kahlua coffee and just waiting for the sun to come up. And just slowly light would start to emerge. And I could eventually I could sort of see the difference between the ocean and the sky. And then eventually, the lights out there on the ocean, I could see, oh, that's a cruise ship and that's a fishing boat. They were just lights before. Anyway, I make the comparison that it's like the creative process, where when you start, you don't know what the hell it is, but if you just stick with it long enough, it starts to differentiate. It starts to sort of show you what it is, and then you can be a little bit more deliberate, I think, in how you're approaching the project.
And I think, with respect to that too, the more experience you have living in uncertainty as a writer, the easier it gets each time. So for some of our young students, they haven't had that. They're so used to like an outline or something as a way to, and that can work for some people. I don't want to like bag on that, but like, a strict outline, and you've almost like programmatically got it all, figured out ahead of time. But once you just sort of throw yourself into that uncertainty and accept it and work your way through it, it's like it gets easier and easier. At least I find it does each time I write, because I have confidence, like you were saying, Ted, it's going to work out. Oh yeah, this character's two-dimensional right now. I have no idea what's at stake. But if I stay in it long enough, something's going to happen and I'll start figuring it out. And so I think it just comes with time. I mean, and I know I've mentioned this on podcasts before, but Alice Munro in an interview said she doesn't revise as much, or, near the end of her writing career. It's like, because she's written so many stories, she knows what she's doing. And so the process is easier and easier for her as time goes on. So anyway, that's just a thought I have about that.
Brady, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, as you know, I'm great fans of both your works, and but I'll have to disagree with Grant a little bit. I'm not ever sure it becomes easier. I think you guys are such experienced gunslingers. I've only been at this a couple of years younger, so I maybe in the next couple of years I'll turn that corner. But it is exciting, right? It's fun, and we spoke before about what is the purpose of doing this if you don't stick to your vision, and as Grant says, give yourself that space. As Ted says, like, hang in there, see, yeah, listen,
yeah,
to your intuitions. Yeah, it's not a math problem.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Well,
but easier.
Another thing I talk to my students, particularly in the context of workshop, is that they share their work, and generally speaking, it's a first draft or a very, very early draft, and then usually there's a component where we have like an anthology of classic stories or whatever, and so we're reading The Killers, or we're reading whatever in class. Meanwhile, we're also, and so it's very easy for students to compare with what they're doing with the killers or whatever. So in other words, we're giving them all these fantastically complex and beautifully written stories, and so it's very easy to get very self-conscious and discouraged, because the thing that you wrote last night to give to workshop today isn't as polished as that Dostoevsky piece or something that we read. But as I tell them, we have no idea how many drafts that story went through before it became this polished, beautifully written piece. This could be 100 drafts in, so we have to accept the fact that the things we write, especially initially, are just naturally going to be inferior in many ways to the finished, polished product. I also give the example, the novelist Bonnie Jo Campbell. She came to University of Illinois Springfield, when I was adjuncting there, and gave a little reading and talk and so forth. And she read a story that was in the Southern Review, which is a really great literary journal. And I can't remember if it was part of her setup or it came up in the Q&A, but she said that she had been working on that story for 20 years. That she first started writing it, and she liked it, but she just couldn't get it right. And she'd come back every 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and she'd work on some more and play with the ending. And finally, after 20 years, she thought, okay, this is ready. And so she sent it out, and Southern Review published it and so forth. And I say, no, obviously that's a little extreme, but we have no idea how many drafts and so forth. And I will just mention, I want to read Bryn's contributor's note here while I got the screen. But I went to her website, Bryn Chancellor's website, and she's got a note on there about this story, Radio Sky, where she thanks I think 3 editors of Ecotone for all of the help with research and proofreading to make sure she got all the details correct. So that ended up a kind of a group project in a way. It wasn't just her own writing. Let me quickly throw it in here before I forget, and then we hopefully can go back maybe to some of those thoughts. But this is the contributor's note at the back of the journal. It says, Bryn Chancellor is the author of Sycamore, a Southwest Book of the Year, and When Are You Coming Home?, winner of the Raz Shoemaker Prairie Schooner Book Prize, as a recipient of fellowships from the North Carolina, Alabama, and Arizona Arts Council, and the Poets and Writers Maureen Egan Writers Exchange Award. She lives and teaches in Charlotte, North Carolina. And again, she does have a website which lists, her books and things. And then she seems to be on Instagram, although not super active. And I didn't find her on X or anywhere else, but maybe she's on some other social media site. But anyway, that's our featured author here, Bryn Chancellor.
One of the things, just thinking about the way of books and the way of writers, in response to some of Ted's comments, we've talked in this podcast about Hemingway, and that that's really controlled material, particularly in the short stories. And I think about Ray Carver, and how working with an editor, and how his stories were chopped down to those distillations that hit so hard, and Pound's relationship with T.S. Eliot, and the cuts to that making those cuts to the wasteland that gave it also that incredible atomic, the weight of uranium in the lines. But on the other hand, some of the how we think about work and about craft and presenting work. One of our writers, I know Ted is a huge fan. I mean, and perhaps Grant as well. But Melville wrote at frantic speeds, and he called Moby Dick a draft of a draft, and he wrote 400 pages in the space of months. And like there's different ways. Like I like big, messy, all over the place writers as much as I like the really precise, really polished. So as a matter of how we think about what we do and what we like and what kinds of stories we like, I mean, this story is really well crafted, right? It has that kind of precision to it. But then I like some of the messier writers a great deal too.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Jack Kerouac, and I just love On the Road. But you know, and it's George Simonal, who wrote the McGray novels. I read
Yeah.
somewhere, I don't know if I've got this right, but he could write like 10,000 words a day.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Every day.
oh, every day. No wonder he like wrote somebody, but I love the McGray novel. I ain't going back on that. That was his style,
Yeah.
and he's in my opinion, a great writer of crime fiction. So yeah,
No, the Romandeurs I think are even better than the McGray.
I've read some of those put up by NYRB Books or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, they're fantastic. Great
oh,
noirs.
yeah.
You know, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And you know, the other thing I would say, I remember being a young writer as if it were yesterday, and like reading Bernard Malamud for the first time and wanting to write like that, and just comparing myself to the assistant and to his short stories like a summer's reading and choice of profession, and I was like, how does he do this voice? I remember being really frustrated because I couldn't, like it's not just imitation. It's like I like that style of writing, that narrative telling style. I want to break out and do something. And it took a long time, but I just kept working at it. And then eventually some of Malamud got melded with my own voice and my own style. And so I would just say to people out there, just stick with it. But I know what that feeling of frustration is like as you read The Killers or whatever, and you're like, my voice is nowhere near this. I even had a professor say to me, I'm like 27 years old, I'm taking workshop classes, and he said I lacked vision. And I just remember being
Dude,
crushed by that. What does that mean? You rolling some dice, you a holy roller? What do you mean vision? And he meant you don't have you don't have a view of the world, you don't have a perspective, you don't have your own voice, and it was crushing. But you know, you just got to be patient, and the voice will be there, it will emerge at some point. Took me till I was in my 30s, but I feel like, you know, and it keeps evolving. But yeah, Malamud was huge, and I think one of the things that helps is reading craft books, because as I mentioned before, I read Joan Silber's book with Gray Wolf called The Art of Time and Fiction. And once I read that, I understood how Malamud did what he did. Here I am in my 50s, or yeah, my 50s. I'm reading this book. I'm like, that's how he does it. Now I know the trick, you know. And so I would recommend reading really well written books on the craft of writing, and then you can apply some of those techniques and knowledges to your own work.
Yeah. Brady, thoughts on that?
oh, yeah. Just in the course of the conversation, I think I think I see some guiding principles. Stick with it.
Yeah.
Take this project of if you want to do this, take it seriously. Give yourself time. Don't cut yourself off. And then all these techniques we've talked today about modes of characterization, strategies, and Grant's variables, and the change of course in the story. I mean, there's it's a lot, and so give yourself, you know, take a you know, folks who are interested in this, take a breath, take your time, let something emerge. Think about revisions. I mean, I like Grant's that the way that Grant describes of working. You know, you have an idea, and Ted was talking about this too. You just start, and then maybe you'll see what's going on, or maybe the sun will rise on the story, and then Grant talks about, well, then this is the opportunity for layering. This is a vast kind of process. So yeah, give yourself some time, enjoy it, and you know, live with the doubt and the uncertainty, and yeah, failure.
Yeah, for me, when I'm writing, I'm more alive than anything else I do. To me, it's like the most exciting, fun. Yeah, there's a lot of hard work involved. I'm not trying to make it sound like a party, but it is. You know, it's my drugs. You know, I don't need drugs. I need, you know, blood pressure meds and cholesterol. But you know what I'm saying? But I yeah, it's to me, it's the high point of the day. It's just super, super exciting. I love living in the world of fiction. So, and the finding where the journey's going to take me. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's my form of meditation. I find that if I do hit a stretch where, for whatever reason, I can't write creatively, I don't write when I'm on vacation, for example, when I'm traveling. I know some writers do. They'll keep writing while they're taking a cruise down the Rhine or something. But to me, when I'm traveling, my antenna is about absorbing everything, and eventually, hopefully, it'll filter into my writing. So sometimes I go for several days without writing, and I do start to get sort of itchy and like I got to get back to this, because that's how I kind of make sense of the world, or it's kind of a grounding operation, or something like that. Hey, I wanted to you know we, we're going to talk about character description, and I think we still can squeeze something in along those lines, and I thought this was a good story to use in that regard too, because we get some really effective description. And I just want to read a couple of examples. And interestingly, this story, Radio Sky, begins with character description.
Yeah.
I tend to discourage my students from doing that, because it seems like they just get a really interesting narrative going, and then we got to stop and hear that somebody's wearing a sweatshirt and tennis shoes, and and it's like, okay, we don't need to know any of that. I think this works because it's so integrated into the character's persona. It helps us to understand who the character is. It's more than just helping us visualize the character. It's actually helping to start us to get to know them at a deeper level. So I mean, I've already read it, but I'll just kind of remind us. Lou strapped on a sun hat and tugged up her bright yellow and black compression socks with "I'm the bee's knees, motherfucker" printed on the band. And then, so again, that's the very first paragraph, first couple of sentences. And then we've mentioned this doubling type person who shows up. Eventually, the woman had long, pale hair and wore square, mirrored sunglasses. The top of her left ear stuck out at an angle. Her lenses flashed as she held the bottle to Lou's lips. Water sluiced down her chin. She coughed. And we get a couple other little touches here and there, but I won't take up time reading them. But we do tend to get character description as soon as the character is introduced to us. And obviously, this writer does that very effectively. I'm not convinced it's an absolute necessity. The last episode or two, Brady talked about Faulkner, and that really whetted my appetite for some Faulkner. So I went back and I read The Bear in particular, that novella. And I remember when I read that initially, one of my takeaways was, my God, we're 2/3 of the way through this really complex novella before we ever get a physical description of the main character. And I hadn't even noticed. But Faulkner doesn't give us a physical description until suddenly it's necessary in the story for us to know what the character looks like. I think most writers, particularly newer writers, their impulse would be, again, as soon as a character is introduced, give us some physical description. But Faulkner proves, and I know a lot of authors have proved, that isn't necessarily the case. You can really hold off on that until the pivotal moment in the story or the novel or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned Malamud earlier, and to me, there's some narrative telling going on right away at the beginning of this story, which is not what I was taught in workshop. Is always start with action and then later bring in the exposition. But there's some pretty important exposition right at the beginning. The failed business. There's a couple other things that are Kiki, I think is the name of the bit. The problems with mom. It's all in the first paragraph as a setup, and I think that's kind of old-fashioned storytelling, but done really well.
One of the since we've evoked Melville throughout the course of our podcast, but of course again today, one of the great features of Moby Dick is that we don't see Ahab until 100 and whatever pages into it, but we have heard of him, and we have had bits and pieces, not super detailed, but bits and pieces of descriptions of what he looks like, right? It works so well, right? Of course, that book is huge, and it's quite a different business in a short story where everything's moving along at light speed. but yeah, there's different ways, and as Ted says, Faulkner, yeah, I mean, as a general bit of advice, if Faulkner does it, it's probably pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, Melville, that's a great example about Ahab, but yet, again, to contrast that in Bartleby the Scrivener, if you recall that great short story, I always would try to figure out a way to teach that whenever I had an opportunity. When we're introduced to Bartleby's other Scriveners, the other people who work in the law office, there's like one long paragraph where Melville's like, takes it off. Okay, here's Turkey, and this is what he's like, and we get some physical description and personality. And this is Nippers, and this is what they're, and it's a very, very workmanlike. Okay, you need to know who these people are. You need to know a little bit about them. Here it is, reader. Get into it because we need to move on with this narrative. So Melville could be very, concise and workmanlike when it suited his purpose, which it was in that particular story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's
Go ahead, Bree. I was just going to say real quickly, Orson Welles said one of the great characters to play in movies is what he called the Mr. Wu character. I don't know if that was being racist on his part, but Mr. Wu would be a character that everybody else is talking about, and it builds up all this interest, and then you get to enter, somewhere in the second act, late in the second act, and wow, isn't that exciting? Because we've got all these different prismatic, portraits of Mr. Wu. And so, of course, like The Third Man, a classic noir film, classic crime novel by Graham Greene. It sets up, we keep hearing this perspective, that perspective about Harry Lime. And then finally, there's that great scene where Holly Martins meets up with Harry Lime in the streets of Vienna. So I think it's a great technique for building character, to have all these different perspectives and build suspense. And then we see the character, and the character is struck by, he is alive. What the hell?
That's
so,
right. in bombed out Vienna, no less.
Yeah, it's bombed out. It's just great. So like the Mr. Wu thing, it's good technique, folks. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and I was going to say with Ted about Bartleby, the description of turkeys and Nipper, it establishes, I mean, we get the descriptions and we get their psychology, right? The sort of thumbnail is telling, not showing kind of way, but it also has this great thematic because it establishes the sort of mechanical, the engine, the driving pistons of the enterprise of this unbearable labor that these folks are involved in. And so it has this casting a kind of tone of the story. And so yes, you get these thumbnail sketches of the characters, but it also establishes this mechanistic, blank-walled capital world. Yeah, it's great. I was going to grab my coffee cup. It says on the side I would prefer not to. Oh, I'm going to grab it.
Yeah.
I often invoke Bartleby when someone asks me, and I express I would prefer not to. I always write, as Bartleby would say.
So, we've been talking, Ted and I, Grant, before we got started today. We were talking about the problem we have of finding time for everything, because like things are interesting, like we enjoy this and we want to do this, but the fine art of saying no. How do you do that? So a student once, a graduate student, after they graduated, chaired their project and very kindly gave me this coffee cup as a thank you. So yes, I take this to this cup to department meetings sometimes.
I mean, I am such a people pleaser. I really struggle with saying no. I wish I would do that more often, to carve out time for myself. But it's hard.
Well, and I've talked a couple different episodes about, that's one of the challenges of being a writer or any kind of an artist. It really does require a significant chunk of time and solitary endeavor and so forth. And there aren't really very many people in our world. Maybe for some of us, there literally are no people in our sphere who want us to do that. They don't want us to be solitary and isolated and so forth. And they've got all these demands on our time. And again, they deserve our time and our energy. So yeah, to carve out that time, I've always had to just get up like super early. I wasn't one where I could squirrel away, while my kids were around when they were younger and just hide out and not be a part of the world. I just had to just get up super early before everyone else did. I know Michael Chabon talks about when his kids were younger, he did the opposite thing. He would wait till they all went to bed, his kids and his wife, and then he would go and write most of the night, and so forth. So it can work on either end of the day. But I think a lot of writers, find the tail end or the beginning of the day as a time when they can do their thing, because the rest of the day, their demands are kind of elsewhere.
Yeah, my problem is I tried doing that late at night thing because it's kind of cool. I'm a night owl, but it's a disaster. The other day with the new novel I'm working on, I started at 10 and I'm like, I'll just write for an hour. I wrote till 2 a.m. and then I couldn't sleep. I was up till 7 o'clock. I mean, I
Too wound up.
Yeah, I was too wound up. Like I was like, oh, I got all these ideas in my head, and the whatever the synapses, electrons, whatever you tell me out here, radio things in the brain. It was like lots of could not sleep. So I don't write in the morning, but I do like as soon as we get done here, I'll write for a couple of hours. I like the early afternoon before I start needing a nap, But yeah, it's whatever works for people. And just to come back to something you said earlier, Ted, I don't write every day at all. I mean, I wish I could. I mean, I always hear that's the way to roll. It just doesn't work for me. So I might write for 6 months and then I'm suddenly reading for 6 months. That's just kind of my biorhythms. I find that's what works for me. I used to beat myself up over it, but then it's like, give yourself grace. This is your process. Embrace it. Don't let someone else tell you what it should be. You got to write every day. I don't write every day.
Well, I've told you, Grant, that Raymond Carver, apparently did that too. He would write for months and months and months, pretty religiously and get a book done or a series of stories or whatever. And then he would just take a few months off. And he compared it to letting the well fill up. He said, that it was better for him overall to take some time away rather than try to keep grinding it out year upon year upon year. So, Brady, what's your methodology?
Oh, I got to work in the morning. I've noticed, for me, there's a switch about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my brain stops. Like, if I can find, my way downstairs to make a cup of tea or something, like that's kind of the rest of my day. I mean, I can read and stuff, but I can't, like, the language stops working. So I'm definitely a morning, get up and get to work. But one thing I would observe on the matter of habits and how we work, and I think Grant's exactly right, because the measure for me is what have you done, at the end of the day. And so Grant is in what world or in what way could we say you're not productive?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not, I think that's great. Recharge, let the well refill, rest, read, take that deep breath. I think that's great. At the end of the day, what do you have? And so all these great short stories, the noir novels, the stack of books, is a pillar in your house and in your life. And so, yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the spirit of so much of what we've said over the course of the podcast so far is, be true to yourself. Let you give yourself the time and the space to find out how and what you have to say and how you're going to say it and by what means you can make that happen. Yeah, I mean, we're sort of, our kids are all grown now, so it's a little easier.
Yeah,
perhaps, but take your time.
Yeah. Well, as your publisher, Grant, I would maybe recommend just slowing down a little bit. I'm already like 2 books behind. Come on.
That's sorry.
I know we're getting close to the time where we probably should shut this off. But I did want to say though, one of the things I really admire about both you guys and why I'm your publisher is you're not willing to settle for a sort of half-assed job. Grant, you've got this series going and you've got these characters that keep reoccurring, but you are constantly trying to figure out new and innovative ways to structure the books, to structure the stories. And of course, Brady, Journey to Al Ramel, I'm having nightmares about, but
Right
I
on.
love it. I love it. And I really respect all the different narrative moves you're making in that. And yet I know the stuff you're working on now is very different from that. So we're not content to just do what we've done, but to really be creative about how we're approaching it. And I really appreciate that. So that too takes up, time and energy and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I'm a big fan of Elvis Costello. And I just admired how every album was different that he was doing. Like, he did not want to keep doing the same music. So, he does a soul album, he does a folk album, he does a country album, it's like he's all over the place. He's so eclectic. And Steinbeck, I mentioned this to you, Ted, but he does like a proletarian novel, like in Dubious Battle. He does like a really short novel, like of Mice and Men. He does sort of more of a comical novel with Sweet Thursday and Cannery's Row, and then he does like an epic, like East of Eden. He does a kind of 1930s epic, Grapes of Wrath, which is different from East of Eden. Like, he was constantly challenging himself, wanting to do, even did a musical, Pipe Dreams or something. But so I admire that about Steinbeck, not wanting to repeat himself. And I think that's exciting.
Yeah. Brady?
No, I agree. And I part of we've been talking too about creative process and the fun of this. And so I want to give a little plug. So Ted and I talking about A Journey to Al Ramel, and so ideas for covers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. It's just, I mean, a part of what, and Grant, we've all said this, it is really fun. All of this is really fun. I mean, it's hard.
Right.
Yeah, but I will chime back in. I like writers who reinvent themselves. I think I mean, your description of Steinbeck, I don't think Steinbeck gets a lot of respect anymore. I think the Grapes of Wrath is probably holding in there a little bit. But yeah, there was some immense talent there, and the ability to kind of reimagine the process and the projects. Yeah, terrific.
All right. Well, we probably should give our listeners a break here. I actually really wanted to talk to you guys more about your projects you're working on, but maybe we'll have to save that for next month. But I really appreciate your chiming in. I know we're all super busy. You guys are super busy. So I appreciate your making time today, and I certainly appreciate our listeners and viewers. I will say that I know that some of our listeners are actually going and purchasing some of the individual copies of the literary journals that we're talking about. So that's fantastic. Literary journals need the traffic. 12 Winters Press needs the traffic too, by the way. But so that's great. So I'm glad people are getting a lot out of the podcast. I'm glad that we're supporting the arts, including having people go to some of these journals and buying copies and reading the stories themselves and so forth. All right. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, unless you guys have some burning thing you want to say right here at the end.
Just I apologize for jumping the shark early in the discussion.
Hell, it may be a better approach because obviously we didn't have trouble coming up with stuff to say. So maybe that's a better way of doing it.
No, we didn't panic.
Yeah,
we hung in there.
Yeah,
yeah. Grant, what? Why is Grant talking about the story? What do we do now? Well, we didn't panic.
You guys were
Grant,
awesome.
Grant, with your experience in community theater, I'm sure you've had that experience where somebody on stage, and maybe it was you, is suddenly 10 pages ahead of the script of where they're supposed to be.
Yes. And just to come back to the uncertainty thing, I'm not scared of going off book anymore because I've done enough plays. So I know when I go off book, I will solve the problem and my fellow actors will help me solve the problem, but we'll get back to where we need to be. So I have that confidence because I've done enough of them,
Well, 42 years of teaching has given me a fair amount of improvisational confidence as well. So
absolutely.
All right, guys, I'm going to hit the stop record here button and we'll talk a little bit here, but thanks viewers and listeners.